Hello everyone, it's Wednesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. South Korean President Yoon is on 6-day state visit in the United States, and in just a few hours, the summit between Seoul and Washington is to begin. The highlight of the summit is expected to be how credible Washington's extended deterrence commitment to Seoul would be. Details of such extended deterrence, the so-called action plan, is reportedly going to be signed as a special statement in addition to a joint declaration. If it is, what milestone would it be for the ROK-US alliance? And how should South Korea deal with tensions related to China and Russia while keeping a secure relationship with the United States? For an in-depth analysis, we invite Go Myong-hyun, Senior Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, into the studio. Dr. Go, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
And we also have Professor Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor at King's College. Good to see you, Professor.
Thanks for the invitation.
All right, first question to our Dr. Go. Now, among the key agenda items at the summit is strengthening the two countries' joint defense posture. And so far, deploying the tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula or setting up a nuclear sharing framework with South Korea similar to that of NATO's, it apparently seems to be ruled out by the Biden administration. Now, what are they and why not those strategies being used?
So basically what the NATO and the United States have is actually a nuclear sharing agreement. Nuclear sharing agreement meaning a nuclear state like the United States is sharing its nuclear weapons with a non-nuclear states like the states in Europe. Well, we obviously United Kingdom and France are nuclear states in NATO, but then nonetheless there are other non-nuclear states in the NATO. So the idea is that the United States will be using its nuclear weapons and allow the participation of NATO states in employment of those nuclear weapons. But then when we talk about the nuclear sharing, there are different levels to nuclear sharing process. So there's the planning component, broadly speaking. There's also the employment component. Employment here meaning the nuclear use, how to use nuclear weapons, against whom and when. And the planning is how the militaries of the NATO member states are going to incorporate the use of nuclear weapons in hypothetical contingency scenarios. So in this case, in the NATO case, we have the planning process. There's an employment process because the NATO states are allowed to carry the U.S. nuclear weapons, and most notably in the form of aircrafts, the fighters, bombers, that can carry U.S. nuclear weapons. So that in that sense, it's actually the maximum of expression of a nuclear sharing that we witness today. Compared to that, in South Korea and the United States, we don't have such an arrangement. There's the recent agreement that's expected to be announced soon in Washington. Essentially, it's going to emphasize the setting up of the planning component of the nuclear sharing of. There's no nuclear sharing, but the planning component of a joint nuclear policy between South Korea and the United States. So you can see this as the first step towards a more complete nuclear sharing arrangement that, for instance, NATO has today. So for now, we're talking about planning. So there's no employment component. So there will be no process or arrangement in which South Korean combat aircraft will be able to carry American nuclear weapons. But then again, this is again the start of a process. At least that's what we think right now. So eventually, we hope that this nuclear sharing process is going to be more complete.
Right, I see. So it is the first step to do so. Now, Professor Pacheco-Pardo, instead of using these measures, the South Korea and the U.S. are reportedly discussing to include a stipulation regarding nuclear retaliation by the U.S. in the event North Korea launches nuclear attacks on the South. What significance would this stipulation have?
Well, I think it is quite significant in the sense that essentially the U.S. Would be committing to nuclear retaliation if necessary in case of a nuclear strike by North Korea. And this would help to dissipate the doubts that many Koreans have about whether the U.S. is willing to trade off Los Angeles, for example, for Seoul, meaning that if there is a nuclear strike on South Korea, would the U.S. be willing to retaliate, considering that potentially North Korea could also launch, or at least theoretically launch a strike on the U.S. So I think this agreement would help to alleviate the doubts that many South Koreans have. I still do think that the nuclear sharing agreement probably is necessary by now, as described by Dr. Ko very accurately, because I think that otherwise these calls that we see in South Korea for the country to develop its own nuclear weapons are only going to continue. The nuclear threat coming from North Korea is only increasing by the day with new delivery systems. And I do think that having witnessed Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a state that used to have nuclear weapons in its territory and gave them up, I think the U.S. needs to give more assurances to South Korea than has been the case until recently.
Right, so it is a part of an effort to give assurance. Now, Dr. Go, so Washington's such vow to send a clear and demonstrable signal of extended deterrence commitment to Seoul comes amid North Korea's evolving nuclear and missile capabilities. And Chief of U.S. Forces Korea, he recently said that North Korea is developing the second strike capability. What is this about, and how serious do you believe U.S. is evaluating the North Korea's, this kind of capability?
So the second strike capability on the part of the North Korea signifies that the North Korea has been able to deepen its nuclear arsenal. So one way to express or actually materialize the second strike capability is just having a quantity, a sufficient number of nuclear warheads that can survive a surprise nuclear attack by an opponent. And also, there are different ways to enhance the survivability of your nuclear arsenal. For instance, by putting in special silos underground, or have your submarines carry those nuclear warheads in deep underwater. So North Korea, we know North Korea is developing ballistic missile capable submarines at the moment. But then the overall consensus is that North Korea is unable to achieve a completion of that technology in the near future. It's a very complicated and sophisticated technology. Whereas what North Korea is doing instead is essentially diversifying and deepening the scale and scope of its nuclear arsenal. We know North Korea has produced different types of tactical nuclear weapons, and then as of today, it is estimated that North Korea has at least 100 or so nuclear warheads, and then we expect North Korea to have double that number by 2027. And then also North Korea has come out with a very innovative and ingenious ways to hide their nuclear warheads. So underground silos is an example of that. They have even used even hidden their nuclear ballistic missiles in water reservoirs.
Right.
So these are the innovative ideas that North Koreans are coming out with to signal to the United States that they have so many nuclear warheads and they are able to hide them. And then it signifies that even if the United States or South Korea can detect some of the launches that North Korea might carry out to suppress attack against South Korea or Japan, and then United States and South Korea respond, some of those nuclear warheads will be able to survive the first wave of attack by the Allies, and then use them to attack with nuclear weapons against South Korea and the United States and Japan. So this is the major concern on the part of the United States, because it shows that there's no complete and full capability to respond to North Korea's nuclear threat. That for that reason alone, we need to have very strong deterrence capability, meaning if North Korea succeeds in using nuclear weapons against South Korea or Japan or the United States, the United States will be able to respond in a way that it spares the end of the regime.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Pacheco-Pardo, with Seoul and Washington seeking measures to raise trust in extended deterrence, watchers are actually keeping a close eye on the reclusive regime to check whether there will be a serious level of provocation. Up until now, North Korea is remaining quite silent than expected, but what kind of moves by North Korea might we see?
Well, I would expect missile tests. I think that's a given. I think we have moved beyond considering these provocations and actually considering this part of North Korea's development of its own missile program and nuclear weapons delivery program, of course, as well. And North Korea making political points. For example, we see the joint exercises between South Korea and the US. So probably we'll have to think about what type of a missile will be tested. It could be that an ICBM is tested again. Other types with shorter ranges, I think that's a given that there will be tests. The big question, of course, is the nuclear weapons test, but I think we have been talking about it for over a year now, and if we are honest with ourselves, we don't know if a nuclear test is going to take place. Probably Kim Jong-un himself doesn't know if he wants to conduct a nuclear test, because there are many variables that he needs to consider, including, of course, his relationship with China and, to an extent, with Russia as well. So I would say that missile tests, we should prepare for them. When it comes to a nuclear test, I think it's very uncertain, and certainly myself, I have stopped predicting the possibility of a nuclear test because I think we simply don't know if this is going to happen.
Right, I see. We should just wait and see. Now, Dr. Go, during the latest interview with NBC News, while saying that it is unrealistic to expect a denuclearization deal with North Korea anytime soon, President Yoon Suk-yeol underlined the importance of making sure North Korea never dares to resort to its own nuclear weapons. Do you believe Washington's, extended deterrence will be able to play that role?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are so-called 3 C's to deterrence. So there's communication, there's capability, there's credibility, and there's capability. So all 3 concepts are related. So if you have a sufficient capability, then in itself it makes the capability and threats credible. And you need to have a communication with your opponent to ensure that the opponent understands what will happen if you take certain actions. So in case of North Korea and the United States, what the United States is signaling to North Korea is that, first of all, there's no disagreement that the United States counts with the capability. And then also, because of the capability, the United States is making sure that each threat to retaliate against any attack against its allies in the East Asia will be credible. So lastly, what the United States is doing right now is communicating that message to North Korea. So in that sense, I think so because there's nothing to disagree with the United States when it comes to all these different C's. It's very likely that North Korea gets the message from Washington that no matter how many nuclear weapons or missiles it develops, it will never be able to match the U.S. capability, and that means that the deterrence against North Korea actually works.
Right, interesting to know about these 3 C's. Right, Professor Pacheco Pardo, meanwhile, a bipartisan group of senators on Monday introduced a resolution which included how they are in support of South Korea's integration into Quad. Now, how do you see the possibility of South Korea joining Quad? And given that China has been beefing up its criticism of the South Korean government's diplomatic tilt toward the U.S., is South Korea's eyeing of the Quad or even G7 what Beijing has been worried about?
I think it is one of the worries on the part of China. I think, frankly speaking, that China is going to criticize South Korea no matter what. It's going to find a reason to criticize South Korea, whether it's discussion about the Indo-Pacific, whether it's South Korea's upcoming attendance of the G7 summit taking place in Japan next month, or working more closely with the Quad. In my view, we have to consider 2 variables when it comes to the Quad itself. The first one is that the Quad is still work in progress, and we have seen a growing discussion about the need for a Quad plus in specific areas. For example, if the Quad countries cooperate on areas such as semiconductors, electric batteries, technologies, the group itself is not credible if you don't include countries such as South Korea, potentially including cooperation with others such as Taiwan, even if this is a bit more difficult from a political point of view. So there is this element. The other element, of course, is that there's cooperation between Quad countries in different areas, working groups, technology, as I just mentioned, health issues is another potential area for cooperation. But we should remind ourselves that there is a big division in the Quad when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we have seen how India has really taken a different position from the 3 other Quad members, the US, Australia, and Japan. And I mentioned this because there are discussions, not only in South Korea, also in Europe, about when it comes to cooperation with the Quad, when the Quad is divided on this very important global issue, is it really worth it to actually become part of the Quad, or is it better to simply cooperate on an ad hoc basis? And I think that when it comes to South Korea, this remains an unsolved issue at the moment.
Right, I see. Now, Dr. Go, discussion on war in Ukraine is also expected to be included during the summit. And President Yoon recently raised the possibility of South Korea providing lethal aid to Ukraine, but just on Monday, he says Seoul has to take into account South Korea's relationship with Russia. Seoul certainly seems to be in dilemma, right?
Well, clearly, but then the President Yoon's statement regarding the prospect of providing lethal assistance to Ukraine was a conditional statement. Essentially,
right.
what President Yoon has said is that if there's a mass casualties or civilian casualties taking place in Ukraine, then Korea will have no choice but to provide military assistance directly to Ukraine. And
Right.
But then we have to think about the context in this statement took place, especially what's going on in terms of the combat situation in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is at a standstill right now. There's not much of a major battle going on. We are only looking forward to Ukraine to carry out the spring offensive soon. But then overall, we don't see a high likelihood of a mass civilian casualty event taking place in Ukraine anytime soon. So in that sense, the prospect of South Korea providing lethal military aid, which could provoke Russia to retaliate, is pretty low. So it was a pretty safe statement to make, in fact. And there's also in exchange for making that statement, South Korea actually garnered a lot of goodwill from the like-minded states, both in the United States but also in Europe. So it was a net win-win for Korea and its like-minded states and allies. So in fact, I think many of the domestic criticism made it out against President Yoon's statement. It's very unfair because it's a conditional statement talking about the possibility, which is kind of remote at the moment, and at the same time scored a lot of positive points among the allies. So in that sense, I think it is not so much to worry about that statement.
Interesting. Now, Professor Pacheco-Pardo, though our Dr. Go said the prospects are low, after President Yoon signaled a possible shift in his stance against arming Ukraine for the first time during the interview, the Kremlin, in response, said supplying arms to Ukraine would make Seoul a participant in the conflict and hinted at possible military cooperation with North Korea. How is Russia seeing Seoul's stance?
Well, I think we have to differentiate between direct aid, direct support, military support, that lethal aid that South Korea may provide to Ukraine, and what South Korea is doing already. The deal that South Korea signed with Poland, discussions taking place with the US, with Romania. We do know that South Korean tanks, howitzer, potentially artillery shells, are making their way to countries that are also supporting Ukraine. So this means that the Korean government and Korean arms companies are already playing a role in the war. And I say this because I think Russia has already been critical of South Korea. President Putin named South Korea last year as one of the countries that was actually supporting Ukraine, put it in his enemies list. And is one of the few Asian countries in this list, actually. And I think this is because South Korea is already playing a role. It is true that when it comes to direct support to Ukraine, we have mainly focused on aid and other type of military capabilities that are defensive in nature. But when it comes to offensive military capabilities, I think it is well known that South Korea is already playing these roles through third parties. And of course, we have focused a lot on Poland because of the big military agreement signed last year, but it's not the only one. And I think, therefore, that if South Korea were to provide direct military support to Ukraine, I don't think this would make much difference when it comes to Russia's or China's, for example, views on South Korea. They're already critical of South Korea because of the role that it's playing.
Right, I see. Now, since we are running out of time, Professor Pacheco-Pardo, I believe this would be our last question. Now, the alliance with the United States, of course, matters, yet we cannot overlook that about 160 Korean businesses are operating in Russia and that China is Korea's largest trading partner. Now, what kind of diplomacy do you believe South Korea needs to show?
Well, that's the big question, not only for South Korea, right? In Europe, it's exactly the same. You see Japan, even Taiwan discussing the same issue. I do think that when it comes to Russia, more and more businesses from South Korea and other countries are brightening off their investment in the country. The longer the war runs, the more difficult it is going to for them to operate in Russia because of the sanctions regime that South Korea is participating in, along with the US, Europe, Japan, other countries as well. When it comes to China, we shouldn't forget that China needs some of the products that South Korea produces, the high-tech semiconductors, electric batteries that South Korea is producing. Of course, there is some competition with China, but there are of these products in which South Korea is more technologically advanced. So I think it is more difficult today for China to retaliate against South Korea than it was in the past, also because China has economic problems with the US, with Europe, with Australia, even though these are being solved. It has economic problems with many countries. So I don't think it can afford a full-blown trade war with a single one of them, including South Korea.
Right, I see. Now, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition, but thank you, Dr. Go, and of course, thank you, Professor Pacheco Pardo, for your insights. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Now, this is all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.